Hey guys, it's Macias, and we're going to go ahead and get started with the information and material on our next unit. We are going to continue exploring democracy, but now we're going to take a look at England and the establishment of democracy there. Now, with this video lecture, it's going to run the same way as the other one did, where I will briefly pause in between each slide for you to have a chance to stop the video yourself before moving on. That way you can get all the information from each slide that you need. All right. There are some video clips in this presentation as well, so make sure that you're paying attention on those and don't just simply zone out. Okay, so without further ado, here we go. So first we have our map of England. This is the part of Europe that we will now be taking a look at. Switching over from Greece and Rome, now over to England, the Big Island. Now just a little bit of historical background. In 1066 CE, William the Conqueror from France, he went across the English Channel, invaded England, and beat them up and claimed the English throne. Now we'll fast forward a little bit later to King Henry II. Now he was a pretty good king, great statesman. In other words, he was able to negotiate some pretty good stuff for his country. But most importantly, and what we will remember him for, is that he started the idea of common law. And the idea of common law is that laws should reflect the customs and principles of the people. And over time, this became the foundation for English law. Now we're going to fast forward even more to a not so good king. Now his name was King John, and in 1204, John wanted to start a lot of wars. He wanted to fight a lot so that he could get some land. That's what kings did back then. They had to fight so that they could get more land for their nation and their people. So in 1204 CE, John's army was defeated in France. He lost. In fact, this guy lost a lot. All right, he was given humiliating nicknames like John Softsword and John Lackland because he lost land. However, even worse than that, the defeat was expensive in the lands that were lost to the French because these lands were good farmland. And so good farmland meant that lost crops and meant lost wealth for his knights. So in order to kind of make up the difference, John increased taxes on the wealthy and the poor. So now his knights not only had less land because of the losses, now they were getting taxed by John. These taxes increased 11 times over 17 years. Okay, that's a lot of increases in taxes. This made John extremely unpopular. He was so unpopular in fact, that the knights, the nobles, in other words, the aristocracy, they got tired of him losing. All right, John was a loser, and so they got tired of him losing and then taking it out on them in the form of higher taxes. So in September 1214, the nobles, the aristocracy, the knights, they had it. John tried raising taxes on them again. This time they got pretty ticked off, and they more or less rebelled against the king. They came in, they captured London and the London Tower, two major pieces. They're the seats of English government, basically. And they forced John to sign what was known as the Magna Carta in 1215.
In medieval England, in the year 1215, an important document called the Magna Carta was signed. The Magna Carta started an idea that eventually found its way into the American Constitution. That idea was the need to have a system of checks and balances on government power. Before the Magna Carta, or Great Charter, was signed, kings could simply do as they pleased without regard for anyone else's rights. But after the Magna Carta, kings had to obey feudal laws. They also had to share their power with the noble lords and be willing to discuss issues and work out solutions to problems with them. The Magna Carta soon led to the creation of England's Parliament, which is still one of the world's most successful institutions of government. In fact, the Congress of the United States was modeled after England's excellent parliamentary system.
All right, so two of the big things to get out of that little video snippet is that the U.S. Constitution and our Bill of Rights is at least partly based on the ideas from the Magna Carta. In addition, the idea of checks and balances, meaning that in our modern U.S. government, different branches of government check each other's power by basically being able to limit each other's power. So we also get that idea from the Magna Carta.
In medieval England,
Now this here is an image of the actual Magna Carta from 1215. So this thing is like really old, and you can see that it's got some big holes in it here, and it just looks really worn out and run down. Well, I mean, it's hundreds and hundreds of years old. So the fact that it's in one piece at all is pretty amazing. But yeah, that's the original Magna Carta. All right, so the fact that the English aristocracy, they forced the king to sign this document that limited his own power, big deal, right? What's really the significance? Well, nothing like this had ever been done before. So, at least in England and pretty much all of Europe. So, this was the first document that limited the power of a king. All right, we talked about in forms of government how under a monarchy, the king was all powerful, had divine right, all that stuff, right? Well, now the Magna Carta comes in 1215 CE, and now it limits the power of that king. And really, from then on, it limits the power of every king. And it also showed that no man, not even the king, was above the law of the land. And the Magna Carta turned out to be the supreme law of the land, in other words, England. Now, other important things about the Magna Carta is that it only applied to the free men of the realm. All right, so basically this was church leaders, nobles, knights, and free townspeople. This did not cover slaves. It did not cover the poor. It did not cover any of the peasants. All right, so these lower classes of people were not protected under the Magna Carta. All right, they couldn't go up and just simply challenge the king. No, it only applied to essentially the aristocracy. All right, so going over some things that, specific things that were limited for the king. All right, he could no longer just assign taxes without first consulting the nobles, in other words, the aristocracy, and the church leaders. So if they wanted to say no on his proposed taxes, they could. And the king could not just simply raise taxes willy-nilly. He had to essentially get permission to raise taxes. Again, something that had never even been thought of before, much less put into action. The king could no longer take property without fair compensation. In other words, the king couldn't take one's property without first paying them for it. This is known as eminent domain, something that we still use today. The government, whether it's the local, state, or the federal government, cannot simply come in and take land, private property land from someone without paying them for it first. And that payment does have to be fair market value. Okay, so we can be talking some pretty significant money. Also, the king could not delay or refuse justice. Today we know this as due process of law. All right, so it's essentially someone gets their day in court. They have their ability to bring evidence if they are accusing someone, but they also have someone who's being accused also has the ability to defend themselves. Now, the Great Council was made up of these aristocrats, these wealthy landowners, knights, and also church leaders. All right, so they were the ones that kind of had the say as to whether the king could or could not impose taxes. This power became what was known as power of the purse. In other words, the Great Council now controlled the money of the land. Very important. All right. In fact, so important. Make sure it's emphasized in your notes. And for our avid friends, make sure that's asterisked. Okay. The power of the purse, control of the money. All right. This meant that the king no longer simply had control of the money. Now it was the Great Council. All right, so we're going to fast forward a little bit to a king named Edward I, and Parliament, in other words, the lawmaking body that has the power of the purse, is born really under Edward I. Now, this didn't mean that it was a happy partnership. The monarchy and the Parliament were always conflicting over money. The king wanted more money. The Parliament wanted good reasons in order to give the king money. The king didn't always have good reasons, so Parliament didn't always give him the money. This really upset monarch after monarch after monarch. But with the signing of the Magna Carta, the king had limited powers now. And the Great Council, which eventually turned into Parliament, now had more power and power of the purse. Fast forward a little bit more, 1603. Elizabeth I, Edward's daughter, died without an heir. She had no children. So the throne went to James I, Edward's grandson. Not Elizabeth's kid, but a grandson from another child. So this King James believed that he should have absolute power, all right, divine right. So he kind of wants to forget that the Magna Carta even happened. But King James died without being able to put a whole lot of his ideas into action, and so the throne was left to his son Charles I. There's James. Didn't put a whole lot of his own ideas into action, so left it to his son Charles I. Now, Charles was no fan of Parliament either. He also believed in divine right, and he felt that he should be able to pick at the coffers anytime he wanted. But he needed money because he was always, again, a king always needed to be at war so that they could gain more land. Well, this time Charles was at war with Spain and France. Parliament said, no, we want to make sure that you're a winner first before we're going to keep giving you money. So Charles came in and just simply canceled Parliament. Apparently this had never... Parliament had never considered that this was a possibility, and so they kind of didn't know what to do at first. So everybody just kind of went home, and the king's just standing there. Ha! I canceled Parliament. That's right. Now give me my money. Well, for 3 years there was no Parliament, and Charles kind of had his way. But he ran out of money again, and Parliament still held kind of the purse strings pretty tight. They still had control over the money. So in 1628, Parliament has to come back into session because Charles needs more money. But this time Parliament was smart about it. They forced him to sign what was called the Petition of Right. All right, more Charles I, looking fancy with his horse. Now, what was the petition right? Another English document that once more affirmed that the law was higher than the king. So, in effect, Parliament was higher than the king because Parliament made the law. And it ended up being a supporting document to the Magna Carta because it reaffirmed what the Magna Carta originally said, limiting the powers of the king. No one was above the law, not even the king. But Charles ignored it. Divine right. He doesn't have to answer to anybody, least of all Parliament, so he dissolved Parliament again. And he ended up just going out and taxing the English people to get the money that he needed to continue fighting his wars. There's Parliament. That's what it looks like today on the Thames River in London. There's Big Ben over here. Now, just when, not that Charles needed really any more problems, but he created more for himself. So we're going to switch over now to the English Civil War, which is more or less Charles's fault here. But anyway, there are two main religions in England. There's the Catholics and the Protestants. Now, the Protestants are further broken up into a bunch of little sects, like Presbyterian, Episcopalian, a lot of the Protestant names that we kind of know today. Now, Charles, in addition to needing more money, he also wanted to force everyone in his kingdom, in other words, all of England, to follow his Anglican church, what he called the Church of England. Now, some of the Protestants, particularly the Presbyterian Scots, they were like, no, not even. No, you don't just get to make up your own church and now everybody has to follow you. Okay, so they went ahead and assembled an army, and they were rebelling against the king. So Charles, once again, this guy, he needed money, and he called Parliament into session. He was hoping to simply just bully them into giving him more money so that he could go fight these Scottish Presbyterians. That's a cathedral in London. Nice picture. So, Parliament once again tried to pass a law limiting Charles's power, even though there were already laws on the books, documents on the books that limited Charles' power. The monarch had to keep being reminded that this was so. So, when Parliament tried to do this, Charles tried to have them arrested and failed. All right, Charles fled to London and raised his own army. These were called Royalists. And these royalists were loyal to the king. They would fight for the king because they also believed in the idea that a king had divine right and really could do whatever the king wanted. On the other side of it were members of what a religious group called Puritans. And some of these Puritans were members of Parliament, very powerful and influential members of Parliament, and they were known as the anti-royalists. They were the ones who were against the king. No, the king couldn't do whatever the king wanted. The king had to follow certain laws. No one was above the law. And since Parliament made the law, that also was supposed to mean that the king was not above Parliament. All right, there is a kind of like a little statue of Charles I, looking very fancy and wearing entirely too much red. All right, there's Charles I standing in front of Parliament. Parliament apparently bowing to him in just really in respect to the office. But make no mistake, folks, they didn't like him. They didn't want to follow him, but they were not ready for, the whole country wasn't ready for war yet. That would change very quickly. So we have the Royalists and the Anti-Royalists start to have skirmishes, which are small battles, and then they start getting into larger battles. Now the Puritans have a general who was pretty good at fighting. Okay, pretty good at fighting, pretty good at leading, coming up with good strategies and tactics. His name was Oliver Cromwell. and he began winning. He started to win more battles, and started to kill more of the royalists. And so Charles the First, the king, was losing too many soldiers. He was losing. And so, in fact, the war went so horribly for the king and his royalist army that Cromwell and the Puritans were finally able to capture the king. All right, this is almost unheard of. They captured the king and they put him on trial. So think about this for a second and definitely emphasize this. We have the English people rebelled against a king who was not respecting their law. They beat him in combat. They put him on trial. Again, this had never happened before. They put him on trial and they found him guilty. And then they went a step further. They publicly executed the king in London. They publicly executed their own king.
In the meantime, back in England during the early 1640s, insurrection was brewing. And this man, a Puritan named Oliver Cromwell, was about to play a leading role in what would soon erupt into a full-blown civil war. Cromwell was a Puritan whose beliefs had been fostered inside the walls of Sidney Sussex College here at the University of Cambridge. For this particular college was a stronghold of Puritanism during his student years. During the first part of the Civil War, Cromwell lived in this house in the town of Ely, not far from Cambridge. And no doubt its kitchen was a good place for him to think over the difficult problems that confronted him, until his duties as a military leader finally took him away. Cromwell's parliamentary forces captured London and its royal fortress early in the war. So for 4 years' time, the court of the king was based here at Oxford, where strong support existed both for the monarchy and the established Church of England. But eventually, in 1649, King Charles was tried for treason, sentenced to death, and then beheaded. Thereafter, the monarchy was abolished, and Oliver Cromwell, a Puritan, assumed the title of Lord Protector and ruled over England for 5 years' time.
All right, so we have an image here of the public execution of the king. So here we just had the king's head lopped off, and then all the blood spurting out there of the body. All right, very graphic, but black and white. Have a little close-up from a different image. All right, this one's a little more, looks much more simple. So we have the king's head detached from the body, and much less gore. So I guess a little bit more kid-friendly, if you will. But still, it kind of drives home the idea that the people of England had beat the king in combat in a rebellion, had put their king on trial for treason, trying to go over the law, and they found him guilty and executed him. All right, again, never had happened before. Big time here. Now, Cromwell's rule was not all that great. All right, he was a dictator. All right, he ruled England as a military dictator. In other words, the soldiers were always in the streets, making sure that people were in their homes by a certain time at night. They were able to go to their work, come home, and that was about it. All right, so Cromwell also ended up not being very popular. All right, so he had gotten rid of the king, but now he also got rid of the House of Lords, which was a major part of Parliament. All right, so we have the people of England now kind of getting a little worried because this guy that they put in power to go and beat the king has now just eliminated half of their lawmaking body. All right, now that he's eliminated half of their lawmaking body, they have no representation. Well, they've just lost half of their representation. So what are they going to do? Now, Cromwell supported all religions in England except Catholicism. So all Catholics now had to run and hide because if they were caught, they would probably be tried for heresy and executed. But Cromwell was in such a strong position and he had such a control of the military that no one was able to overthrow him. They just, the people of England just had to kind of sit and deal with it for a while. So Cromwell ruled for a little bit and then he died. But he was so popular that, or unpopular, that the people dug up his corpse after he died, put his corpse on trial, and then executed his corpse by hanging it. Very strange, very bizarre, but I guess they wanted their revenge, so they got it. Here's an image of I don't know which one is Cromwell here, but one of them is Cromwell. The dug up corpse was put on trial and hanged like a common criminal. So, again, I guess the people got their revenge. Now, after all this Civil War stuff, the people were kind of tired of military rule, so they actually wanted to restore the monarchy. And this was called the Restoration, meaning that they just reestablished the monarchy as one of the rulers of the land. However, they didn't get rid of Parliament. Parliament was now back in full swing, and they passed a law called habeas corpus, meaning it's Latin for produce the body. Okay, definitely need to know habeas corpus. And really, in short, all it means is that evidence must be shown to a judge before someone can be imprisoned. Sounds like a no-brainer to us today, but back then, it was not a no-brainer. All right, it had to be enforced by Parliament that evidence must be shown. In other words, guilt must be based on evidence, not just because the king said so. Habeas corpus, very important. Now, with Charles II, also had no son, so his successor was his brother, James II, another James. So there was Charles. When he died, no kid, so went to his brother, James. Now, James II was Catholic, one of the religions that was kicked out by Cromwell. Well, now with the king being James, now the Catholics were back in power. And like most kings of this time period, he wanted to gain more power for the monarchy. He wanted to get more of the power back that Parliament had taken from the monarchy because of the Magna Carta, Petition of Right, and all that. So Parliament, of course, is not happy with James II, but they're not quite sure what they can do with him. All right, the English Civil War had kind of weakened the militaries of the Royalists and the anti-Royalists. So what Parliament does is they turn to James's daughter Mary, who was a Protestant, not a Catholic. So that already tells you that Mary and James didn't quite get along. And Mary had married a gentleman named William, also a Protestant. So these two were actually invited by Parliament to come into England, overthrow James, Mary's dad, to save Protestantism in England. So kick the Catholics back out and keep the Protestants in power in England. Now, even though Mary was James's kid, Mary and William, they couldn't pass up a chance to take the throne sooner than they ever could have dreamed they had. So James II raised an army, but it wasn't enough. William and Mary's army was more powerful, and they came in and they defeated James. Now, William and Mary were probably the smartest of the monarchs that we had seen yet, outside of maybe Edward, who had kind of started Parliament. But William and Mary, what they did is they officially recognized Parliament as a partner in governing. And with this recognition, under William and Mary, England became a constitutional monarchy. All right? Laws by the people limited the power of the king. Which also, and since Parliament was the writer and maker of the laws, Parliament was now the greater power in England than the monarch. Monarch was still powerful, but Parliament's power was greater. There's an image of a meeting of Parliament, king seated here, Parliament all around the king. There's an image of William of Orange, Mary's husband, and defeater of James the King, took things over. Now, one final development of democracy in England comes with the English Bill of Rights, drafted 1689. And what this specifically did was list things that the ruler could not do. All right, so now it's in black and white, it's in law, it's in paper. There's no more denying or arguing the point. The king cannot just simply come in and suspend Parliament's laws. All right, there has to be a process. Parliament and the king have to go through a debate and work together to find out if laws truly are unfair and need to be gotten rid of. There are no taxes without permission. Guess whose permission? That's right, Parliament's permission. Parliament has freedom of speech. The king cannot just simply tell them to be quiet and can no longer just ignore them. Parliament has freedom of speech, and the king now has to listen to Parliament. And another powerful thing comes with citizens. Citizens can now petition the king with complaints. So if the king is bringing about practices or trying to raise taxes again and the citizens don't like it, they can petition the king with complaints, and the king has to hear their complaint and either help fix the problem or take it to Parliament to see if it can be figured out through law. All right, so the king has to go through a process just like anybody else. Sure, the king is powerful and he's at part of the top of the government, but even the king now continues to have limits on his power and has to go through a process before he can just make things happen. Now, with the English Bill of Rights, what it also did is that it established restrictions on the royal family's rights. All right, so now it wasn't just the king, but now the royal family had to respect the English Bill of Rights, which meant that hereditary part of divine right was no longer absolute. All right, it wasn't divine right now that gave the monarch power; it was Parliament. The kings still believed that they had divine power, but in reality, their power stopped with Parliament. They could not go over Parliament anymore. There's a couple of images of William and Mary, both as kids, and then later on as husband and wife, rulers of England along with Parliament. Now let's just go over some final ideas on the power of Parliament and the power of the Magna Carta, Petition of Right, English Bill of Rights, all that stuff. Okay, so no British monarch could rule without consent of Parliament, and Parliament could not rule without the monarch. They truly were partners in governing the country. The power of the monarch was limited because of the Magna Carta. Parliament represented the people, but remember, Parliament represented mostly the aristocracy. So the rich people, the nobles, the church leaders, the knights. Lower classes and the poor not really represented in England at all. All right, I don't want you guys to get the idea that the Parliament at this time is just like the Congress we have today. Okay, no, the lower classes were not really represented under Parliament at this time. But it was still a step in the right direction because the power of the king had been limited, and the power of some of the people in the land was now increased. All right, so they had major political power. We get the idea of checks and balances in government. All right, different branches of government, in this case, the executive, the monarch, and the legislative, the parliament, these two branches can check each other's power to create balance in the government. We also get important documents: Magna Carta, Petition of Right, Habeas Corpus, and the English Bill of Rights. All documents, all of these ideas later were trickled down through history, and the American colonies adopted pretty much all of these ideas when they came up with their new nation, the United States of America. All right, so the Magna Carta, Petition of Right, habeas corpus, and the English Bill of Rights, all hugely influential on later democracies, particularly the U.S. Now, in our next lecture, we will be taking a look at the U.S. Bill of Rights because we're going to be doing some comparison and contrast work on these English documents as opposed to the Bill of Rights. All right, so make sure you get all of these notes down. You can go through this video as often as you need. Make sure you go back, review, do your questions and summaries, and we'll see you guys in class.